Welcome to this week's episode of the Rational Stand podcast. I'm your host for this week, Nicholas Woode-Smith. I'm joined by David Ansara, Sean McLaughlin, and Ayanda Zulu. Now, earlier this week, President of South Africa and the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa, displayed some unusual self-awareness when he admitted that the ANC-run municipalities are not doing so great. When he presented the Auditor General's report that only 16% of South African municipalities delivered a clean audit. And he delivered quite transparently, and I was actually quite impressed by his honesty when he said that, well, the ANC, we control a number of municipalities, and it is painful each time the Auditor General comes to report to Cabinet and the report shows that municipalities that do best are not ANC controlled. On the other hand, those municipalities that do best are not ANC-controlled municipalities, and I can say it here because there's nothing wrong with competition. They're often DA-controlled municipalities. Now, unfortunately, he came under a lot of attack from his own party after this and had to backtrack quite substantially, where he then had to add that, these clean audited municipalities are compliant with these regulations, that they haven't transformed South Africans' lives, and that he has now changed the tack, and that if you talk to people from Philippi, Delft, Kayamandi, or Langa, they'll tell you that these clean audits are not resulting in the transformation of their lives, where they live because they are enormous challenges. And this is where DA municipalities must learn a lot from ANC municipalities. Now, David, what do you think about our president's sudden honesty and then sudden backtracking?
Well, Nicholas, I actually have a bit of a different take on this because the DA has been making a lot of publicity out of this, and I suppose, you can't really blame them. But one of the images that really struck me on social media this week was Helen Ziller sharing an AI image of Ramaphosa in DA garb. I think he was running. It was almost like he's running for the DA. Maybe he's running away from the DA. I don't know. There's been a kind of lot of gloating, and then I think he's tried to kind of walk that back. I think your third quote there was a bit of damage control. But in some ways, my take is actually that maybe the DA should be a bit more muted about their response to this, because whilst maybe you could read it as a kind of a moment of humility on the part of Ramaphosa. Ultimately, in some ways, their reaction is such that they're looking and seeking for the validation of the national government for their governance model. And, I would say, well, they should be seizing this moment and saying, well, actually, we need more municipalities to be run in this way. We need our national government to be adopting some of the principles of a liberal approach to governance, cutting taxation, deregulating, and so on. So I think, this was kind of the latest social media stirrings that we saw this week. But actually, I think, maybe we should take a step back and say, well, hang on. Why are you seeking the approval of Ramaphosa for this? That was kind of my take, bit of an unusual one, but I'm keen to hear what the lads think.
I think that's a very good point, actually, there, that the DA is constantly looking for affirmation from the ruling party. Sean, what was your thoughts on this debacle?
Yeah, I thought this was absolutely extraordinary, I have to say. I think this might go down as the one thing that Cyril Ramaphosa said that he will be remembered for. All the politics that I've studied and followed anywhere in Europe, in the US, in South Africa, I've never actually quite heard anything quite like this. Now, my understanding is he did say something similar before a few years back. I'm not exactly sure what, but to stand up in was the FNB soccer stadium in Soweto and say that your opposition party governs better than you, I think that is absolutely extraordinary. P.W. Botha said something famous about, "I will not lead white South Africa down the path of abdication and suicide." That's what he's remembered for. Mandela said a lot of things. Arguably, maybe the most famous was perhaps his Davos speech, saying that South Africa, the ANC, will not adopt African nationalist Marxist policies, and so on. Cyril Ramaphosa, I think, could well be remembered for this, standing up in Soweto. If I'm not mistaken, that was Soccer City. Is that the same thing? I'm not exactly sure, but and saying that the opposition governs better than you. I don't know what the logic in doing that was. It's possibly simply a loss of control of the situation. That this is now that he just went off script and simply just hit a wall. I mean, but the thing is, objectively, it is fair to say that the best run councils in South Africa are DA governed. That's not a political statement. That's actually objectively true. The DA has an incredible record at local government, and I think they deserve credit as an organization, and people are often reluctant to give them credit. They have, to be a DA councillor, you have to go through an extremely rigorous vetting process. I know to be a DA MP, you have to do something like 9 stages, including interviews and assessments and so on. That's the fundamental of a political party. You have to build on the ground structures. And you see that in the DA municipalities. Obviously, the ones within the Western Cape are well known. It just so happens that the only DA majority in the Eastern Cape, which is Kucha, which includes Jeffreys Bay, that area, that is the cleanest, best performing municipality in the Eastern Cape. And in Gauteng's Midval, 10 clean audits. This isn't a political statement to say that they are objectively probably the best administrators in the country. Now, the IFP have a good record as well, but obviously they're much more provincially focused in KwaZulu-Natal. Some of the municipalities that they govern in KwaZulu-Natal have been doing much better. Umlatuze, Richards Bay, and the one beside that, Umlalazi, for example. So, I think sometimes you have to say things as they are. Yeah.
So I think we lost you there. You said say things as they are. So is there anything after that?
No, that was it. Really. Sorry, no, I stopped there. that was
Sorry,
it.
there's a little bit static at the end, so I didn't know if it trails. Ayanda.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for that. Thank you for the intro, and thank you for David for his different view as well. I don't think what David said takes away from what I'm going to say. I wanted to say I differ with him, but I don't think we do differ. I think when I do think or analyze his statement more carefully, the DA does need to stop seeking for validation. So I'm not going to say I differ with that point. But here's the thing. Two truths or two realities can coexist. On the one hand, I mean, it is a matter of fact, as Sean has said, that the DA is a far more competent party than the ANC. And again, this isn't a political statement, it's an objective view. If you look at the record, the DA's track record in the Western Cape, it has a far superior track record in governance than the ANC. So there's no debate about that. But on the other hand, Ramaphosa has, of course, sabotaged his own party ahead of a local government election next year. And if you have been following the ANC's politics internally, there have been negative responses to what he has said. And I think it's important to understand these negative responses in the context of the GNU and the fact that Ramaphosa was effectively the president, who was at the helm of the party when the ANC got into bed with the DA. So in some quarters of the party, there is this perception that this is the man or this is the guy who got our party close to, our enemy, so to speak, ideologically. before the election, I was one of the people who was convinced that a coalition between the DA and the ANC was not going to happen. That isn't to say that I wasn't, leaving space for it, but in my mind, I saw the ANC going into bed with the EFF and the MK party. So I was a bit surprised when I saw the ANC forming a government with the DA. So there is this hostility that certain elements in the ANC have towards Ramaphosa and others who are seen to be near him. And I think in this context, if you look at that statement, even if it is true, it further undermines his position within the party, in the eyes of certain factions who are perceiving him as someone who's basically praising a party which they are ideologically opposed to. So it is an act of sabotage. But on the other end, it is a matter of fact that the DA is a far better party than the ANC in terms of its competence, in terms of its track record when it comes to local government. And some of the responses from ANC members like Kusela Tiko, for example, who's an ANC NEC member, have not been surprising. They have chosen to focus conveniently on the point of audits, and they're basically arguing that clean audits don't translate into good governance. And my point to them was, that is neither here nor there. We aren't debating about clean audits and whether they translate into good governance or not. What we're speaking about here is the quality of governance itself, not the clean audits. And the other thing here, which is also important to note, when we have the debate about the quality of governance in local government specifically, we need to move away from this tendency of using the existence of townships and informal settlements as a metric of good governance. The Western Cape is not the only province in the country which has townships and informal settlements. We have townships and informal settlements across the entire country. So we cannot use the mere existence of townships and informal settlements as a metric of governance. What we need to do is to go into the townships across the country and look which party, even in those townships and informal settlements, is doing better in terms of service delivery. And again, if you do the research, even in the Western Cape and in townships there are issues, of course, we're not going to lie, but even there, again, it is the DA which has a far better record of governance, even in townships, delivering services, whether it's building pools for children, building houses for people, etc. Even there, the DA has a far better track record of governance. So we need to move away from using the mere existence of townships and focus on service delivery. And even there, the DA is doing far better. So just again to round up my main points, Ramaphosa has chosen, for whatever reason, even unintentionally, to tell the truth about his own party, which is incompetent, which has mismanaged local municipalities across the country. He has, in a moment, chosen to be honest and acknowledge that the DA, in fact, is a more competent party than the party which he leads. And on the other hand, he has, of course, politically sabotaged his own party and continued to undermine his own position amongst certain forces within his own organization by acknowledging that truth. And we have seen them responding, criticizing him. And even Kwete Mantashe, who said that ANC councillors are only good for singing and dancing, which, by the way, is true. I mean, they can host all these rallies and, get people to come and support them when they're in court, they protest outside. But when it comes to actually delivering and getting work done, they're failing to do that. So I think those are just my initial thoughts on that.
Thank you. I would love to just extend on the township topic as well. It's especially how inappropriate it is to blame local service delivery and the DA in particular for the plight of townships. Firstly, because there's townships everywhere, as you mentioned, an extremely good point that I would hope people would challenge Ramaphosa on, and they probably are, but he's just going to ignore it. Because I think this is something that opponents of DA love to harp on about, be it the EFF and the Action SA and the Patriotic Alliance as well. But also, would you say that the townships are mostly, the cause of townships in this country, are mostly a problem of national policy? Because it's unemployment is a national policy issue. Crime and gangsterism is a national policy issue. They won't allow federalism of the police. As much as I agree with Martin when he says that the DA should just ignore they should ask forgiveness, not permission, and just federalize the police on the ground, as a lot of ANC officials actually already do. Like it was the mayor of Tshwane who founded his own paramilitary police group.
I think
Is
that
that
was
right, David?
Panyaza Lesufi. I think that was Panyaza Lesufi.
Yeah, it was.
Premier of Gauteng.
Premier of Gauteng, yeah. It was actually larger than that. He made his own paramilitary group. But I think but also to leapfrog from something that you said, Ayanda, and I think this, which has been a topic that we've all mentioned here, before, while the GNU was being discussed and while there was talk of a possible coalition after the last election, a lot of people, including myself, were discussing the possibilities that the DA entering into a coalition would destroy the DA, that it would be subsumed by the ANC. And I think even now, a lot of us still have that fear because we worry that the DA will keep threatening leaving the GNU, but they just never do. And they just, and that they compromise too much and they just give up too much. But at the same time, Sean, I think you're completely right that this is a Rubicon moment for Ramaphosa, as long as the media can keep it stretched. And I think the problem is the media might just let it fall apart and let it fizzle out as they do. And something more fun in their idea comes up. But if we can latch onto something like this, this is a symbol of Ramaphosa losing his grip on his own party and losing the respect of his own party. David, what do you think about that?
So I just want to pick up on what you were saying about ultimately the federalism debate. So Jordan Hill-Lewis a few months ago wrote an op-ed where he said, well, what we need is to amend the SAPS Act, which is the legislation that governs policing in South Africa. And he said, all it requires is the addition of 2 words to section 64(4)(e)(c), I think it's of the Act. And those 2 words are and investigate. So ultimately it says the Metro Police have the powers to prevent crime, and investigate is what he wants to add. He wants to expand the powers of the local police, and I think that is a very good and important argument to be made. But as you point out, and as Martin van Staden, our colleague at the FMF, has written about, the national legislation is controlled by the National Assembly, which has a majority of ANC, EFF, and MK in Parliament. So, and they're ideologically opposed to decentralization of policing. So that's what I was referring to earlier when I said, well, this is an important moment for the DA to now push for more powers. If it is indeed better at governing, it can make a much more credible case for expanding its powers, right? So maybe they could implore the ANC to try and amend the SAPS Act. But I think the point that Martin has made eloquently, and which I made at a panel discussion this week at Podcast Party, is that you actually just need to go ahead and do it. And I think that there's a sense of risk aversion, maybe deference as well from the DA, that they don't want to step on the national government's toes. And I think I'm relatively sympathetic to that. I think behind the scenes, there's often a lot of collaboration between, say, National Treasury and the various departments. There's a lot of budgetary allocations, which gives you a signal of a sense of where the power lies as well. You don't want to upset the people who give you large transfers in terms of your provincial equitable share. But I do think that there is this notion of the doctrine of necessity, which Martin, as a legal scholar, has pointed to, which is that actually a lot of the communities in the Western Cape and Cape Town in particular, and the Cape Flats specifically, are facing imminent peril. I mean, like, this is not just a case of, well, there's like lots more potholes in the roads and there's more leaky pipes. Like there's actual chronic systemic violence. I mean, Ian Cameron, who I think is really a standout MP in this domain, he tweeted a while ago that Mfuleni, which is a area of the Cape Flats, I mean, that had 40 murders in 1 month in August of this year. And that was up something like 60% compared to the same period in the previous year. I mean, and, if you think of just how devastating that is for that community and those families and the individuals themselves who lost their lives, I think, that is crisis level stuff. That's not just a kind of petty crimes and pickpocketing and things. That's gangsterism and gang violence. So, and, I think maybe if we were in an environment where the national government was competent and effective, then you could say, okay, well, everybody must just stay in their lane and there's a distinct separation of powers here. And we'll let the national government get on with its important work and we'll focus on the potholes and the pipes. But I'm afraid that the situation demands something greater than that. And, if you consider, for example, SAPS's forensic capabilities in the Western Cape specifically have been completely hollowed out. Like, they do not have a ballistics team there anymore. So if there's a gun-related violence, who's there to pick up the bullet casings and link it to a particular firearm? That work is just not being done. And that affects the quality of prosecutions. So I think it would be entirely justifiable for the DA to say, well, we're setting up our own forensics department. You can interpret this idea of crime prevention in a broad way. You don't have to be limited to a very narrow definition of that word. And so you wouldn't actually need to do what Mayor Hill-Lewis is proposing. You could actually just go about doing that. And, Martin very colorfully once, referred to Panyaza Lesufi and said, the DA kind of is very tentative and very cautious, but Panyaza Lesufi just wakes up one morning and yawns and wipes the sleep from his eyes and then just declares that he's setting up his own crime fighting unit. And you can maybe point to some dubious motives for why he's doing that and resource allocation issues and all these things, but he just someone did it. So what's stopping, say, Alan Winde or Jordan Hill-Lewis from doing the same thing? So I think, I think these are not normal circumstances. I think we need some creative thinking and also boldness and a bit of risk taking. And I understand that, there's a duty of care over your government actions and what have you, but you also have a duty of care over the citizens of who are your constituents. And, I think one example, sorry, and I'm going on a bit, is at this panel discussion, we had somebody from one of the organized business chambers there, and he was talking about his experience in northern KZN when the July 2021 riots broke out. And there were 3 days of rioting before the SAPS even was able to arrive in Jozini, where he was staying at the time. And, if you consider that situation, like the SAPS is not only incapacitated, it's also fundamentally compromised by criminal syndicates, right? So it's not just that they're ineffective and kind of like these Keystone cops who don't know what they're doing. Like there are a number of police commissioners who have not finished their term because of allegations of corruption. I mean, there are, the crime intelligence bosses in jail, for breaches of the law. So, in a riot type situation in Cape Town, if that hypothetically were to occur and there were mobs going down Long Street and Bree Street and destroying property, the residents of the Cape Town CBD would be justified in saying, well, actually, we can't wait for the SAPS because we put in the call to SAPS and they said, we'll see you in 3 days. We don't have 3 days. So it would be incumbent upon the mayor and his team to act in that situation, to prevent crime, and to follow up and prosecute on those crimes. So, that is analogous to the situation that's happening in places like Mfuleni and other parts of the Cape Flats where there is kind of like war zone like conditions. And so it needs a dramatic response. And if you have to take some risks and push the envelope of the law, then so be it.
Just just in clarification, just to test my memory. So the current law that Jordan Hill-Lewis wants to amend, it says the first part of it's prevent crime, correct? Prevent crime and investigate. He wants to add the and investigate.
Yeah, he wants to add and investigate. Yeah.
So the prevent crime part should already contain investigation, because all the global studies and just basic logic shows that if you want to prevent crime, you have to have capacity to investigate crime that's already occurred. So then there is a possibility to prosecute. So there's actual punishment. But
yeah,
I think
fair enough.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a very important point.
I think the DA should stop asking for permission, because the permission's already been given by the law. They just have a very weird legal team that's, well, I think we know that there's quite a few lawyers in this country. I'm not going to name one except for Pierre de Vos, who have incredibly weird interpretations of how the law is written in many ways. Sean, so back to, I think, the main broader topic, and I think the question which I want to ask you before you can say whatever you want. So do you think that the GNU is going to destroy Ramaphosa's career? And do you think it is possibly might destroy the ANC?
That's a very good question. And I know the DA studied this for a long time and say, if we are going to go into coalition with the ANC in June 24, May 24, we have to be the global exception. We have to be the odd one out, because the global norm all over the world in coalition politics, as you guys probably know, is that the junior partner gets an absolute kicking 5 years later at the next election. So the DA, South Africa, has to be exceptional. Helen Zille said, well, we are exceptional. We won the World Cup back-to-back twice in a row. No one else has done that, so fair enough. But the point is, she's right in the sense that the dynamics around it are very different. Obviously, the decline of the ANC and exposure of corruption scandals over a long period of time and so on. But if, structurally for South Africa, it's very damaging. If you wake up in the morning of the 29th of May, 2029, and this coalition has completely wrecked the DA, and the DA is at 12%, and it's a catastrophic loss. And the ANC has worked its way back up, scraped its way back up to 51%, and you have another 10 or 15 or 20 years of bad ANC policy. At that point, it could well be game over for South Africa. No matter what you think of the DA, love or loathe the DA, the fact is it's the anchor pillar on the opposition side of the spectrum, as it were. Conversely, if it's seen to be in the minds of voters, most of whom are very savvy, by the way, and know exactly what's happening, that if in their minds the DA lands as what is effectively, they're in government, but they're also in opposition, something like that, that could work. And by 2029, you could wake up on the 29th of May, 2029, and the DA has scraped 30% and the ANC 29%. And then you've avoided that trap, and South Africa might be successful. That's a much more balanced political scene, I guess, isn't it? So, there's not too many coalitions around the world where the junior partner has five or so legal cases against the senior partner, against ministers, against legislation, this, that, and the other. And they keep coming. I saw on Twitter last week the DA has taken the ANC to court on NHI, the National Health Insurance Act. So there's that. There's the Expropriation Act. There's 2 or 3 legal acts against ministers. I don't know if they're all still alive or whatever. The point is, there's about 5 legal cases against your coalition partner. This isn't your average coalition. I think that's fair to say. But
don't you think that's a healthy sign of
exactly.
contestation of the issues?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I think the IOR has done research on this. Your average person in the street who is never given in the mainstream media at least the credit that they deserve. They're the ones living these everyday situations, by the way. they're the ones that have to use public health facilities. They're the ones that have to use public health, public schools, or whatever the case may be. If they understand that actually the DA is fighting for something a bit more than what they want South Africa to look like, then, you know, that's potentially a 5-10 percentage point swing that way for the DA. So, yeah, I think it could go either way. Anything could happen, really. Who knows? It's too far out to tell. But I've sort of described those two extremes, which I think are perfectly possible. Now, this sort of leads on to the policing thing, if I may go down this route a little bit. So I think in the early days of the GNU, or sort of towards the end of 24, there was Bella, the damaging health legislation. Then there was the Expropriation Act, which is some of the worst thing you can do for investor confidence. I think that was February 25 or January 25. So around about that time, it just looked as though the DA was getting kicked and was getting trampled on. And it was. Then suddenly lost at sea, they get thrown this lifeline, they get thrown this ring of the VAT hike, and they can campaign against that. I think that VAT hike scuffle, if you like, or that whole learning experience was very formative, because what that might lead into now in 26, which isn't very far away, February 26, now that you think about it. If I were advising the DA, I would say, don't pass that budget unless you get full devolution of policing to the Western Cape. And that would be one key thing that the DA could point to. Maybe even in KwaZulu-Natal as well, where they're in government, by the way, in a coalition. And that would be something that they could work with. It doesn't have, I don't know what form it would take. But the point of that experience in February, March 25 of the ANC realizing that they couldn't pass the budget without the DA, they could have gone and tried to force something through with all those 1% parties if they wanted to, but they didn't. You know, so that shows you that they'll bend. And that would be if I were advising the DA, I would say don't pass the 2026 budget until you get devolution of policing, either to the Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal provincial governments or a lot of the city councils in which you govern as well, which is, by the way, the global norm. In the US, you don't want to mess with a New York Police Department law enforcement officer, by the way, or anywhere around the world, really, for that matter. You can't control policing from one central office in the capital city. That's not really how policing works. So, and I think that whole Cape Flats thing and the whole Western Cape crime problem is coming to a head, and I think that could well manifest in the budget. Yeah, which isn't very far away, as I say. Yeah.
I really hope that the DA does exactly what you're saying, Sean. I hope that they hold firm, they demand trade-offs, because that's what coalition politics is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about trade-offs. I think that the DA likes being polite a lot of the time, but something where I think they have done well in the GNU is that I think that they've done very well at not making themselves look like a junior partner. I think they've made themselves look like an opposition party that happens to be a part of government for the sake of damage control. And I think that that marketing has been well, because I think if you ask a lot of South Africans on the street, I think a lot of them would still identify the DA as outside of government, even though they're technically in government.
Exactly.
Ayanda, what do you have to say about this?
Thank you, Nicholas. Look, I'm not going to be long because I think we do need to move to the next topic. So just 2 points on my end. The first one is to say that David made a very, very good point about enhancing the quality of local governance when it comes to something like security. He also mentioned the point that the police force nationally is incapacitated. That is correct. I may not remember the statistics correctly, but I do know that, for example, we have a shortage of detectives in this country, and we need to have more detectives who are out there doing their work and investigating cases. So an immediate benefit of devolving policing power, which is centralized as it stands, is that you bring more personnel into the police force. We have more investigators at a local level doing work and assisting, the police force itself to be able to conduct its work more efficiently. So the chat about devolving policing power is very, very important because it will help to resolve the issue of capacity. As it stands, we have a capacity issue in the police force. Then to the second point about the GNU and whether it will destroy Ramaphosa's career or not. I hold the view that the ANC, as most of us know, isn't a united party. There are different factions within the party that are competing. I don't think that the difference when it comes to ideology is that huge, but there are competing factions within the organization. And what I do know is that there are factions that aren't in agreement with the current arrangement, which is the GNU, the ANC, and the DA. And they have been expressing this continuously. Even when the GNU was first formed, they expressed this. And even now, they are still expressing this. And what I think is going to happen is that when the ANC holds its elective conference, if I'm not wrong, in 2027, I think if I'm not wrong, when the ANC holds its elective conference then, Ramaphosa is not going to emerge as president. I think that is clear by now to anyone who has been observing. He's not going to emerge as president. And of course, there are other people who are vying for power. I think Panyaza will be one of them. Nomvula Mukunyane already has indicated that she will be one of them. I think also Mbalula as well, who is probably the dumbest ANC member ever, is going to join the ANC race too at some point. But my view is that Ramaphosa is not going to win the elective conference there in 2027. And what's going to happen is whoever assumes the presidency then is going to assume it on an anti-GNU card. So they're going to bash the GNU and say the GNU is a betrayal of who we are as the ANC. It's a betrayal of our ideals as an organization. So they will mobilize other branches and other forces in the ANC on an anti-GNU card. And this is not new if you know the history of the ANC. Even back then, when Zuma in the early 2000s was vying for power, he managed to ally himself with other forces in the alliance, namely the SACP and I think the unions as well, and they managed to push Mbeki out. So here with Ramaphosa, you can expect more or less the same thing to happen. Those who are opposing him, to oppose him on an anti-GNU card and to accuse him of getting into bed with the ANC. So once he doesn't win the ANC presidency, he's not going to return as state president. Whoever becomes ANC president then will also become state president because that is how the ANC works. You cannot exercise power in the union buildings if you aren't an ANC president. So once he loses control of the party, he will lose control of the state as well. So my projection is that maybe early 2028 or even late 2027, the GNU will collapse and Ramaphosa will be pushed out. So it's going to be very interesting to see that when that happens and who exactly is going to assume power in the ANC, whether it's Mashatile, whether it's Panyaza, whether it's Mukunyane or whether it's Mbalula, because there are people who are going to be vying for power. You can tell already that they are vying for power. I think that is more or less my view on those two questions.
I think it's a very good point. And I think that the final thought for that will be, will the compromises with Ramaphosa, who believe that the ANC is collapsing and they need to go into the GNU in order to keep power, will that maintain, is that what's maintaining the dominance of the ANC? And if the absolutists who believe that the ANC should be the only dominant party, will that rush or cement the ANC's control? Now, our next topic is about some more talk about absolutism, is the discussion of the tobacco bill. Now, it's got a very long name, which is the Tobacco Products and Electronic Delivery Systems Control Bill, which I refuse to say that more than once in this episode.
The tobacco bill, aka.
Yeah, the tobacco bill is what we'll could be calling it. Even though some people will might get confused when we say that because it has been under different names, and that's something we might actually discuss during this episode. But for people who have been fortunate enough not to know about this proposed law, it seeks to ban smoking in, and I'm going to have to read through a list here, pretty much any enclosed public space, any public transport, any workplace, and this is extended to residential areas. Exactly. Oh, you're going to be breaking the law hypothetically there, David. I'm pretty sure.
Does the Rational Standard podcast count as work? I mean, it's so much fun. It hardly feels like work.
I think that this is now, we're going to the realm of philosophy here now. But if someone works on your property, hypothetically, by the way the law, this bill's structured, you will not be allowed to smoke on your premises. And the way so a lot of people where this has been uttered, it's been confirmed. If you have a hired domestic worker on your property, you're not allowed to smoke on your property. But even extended, if I have a home office on my property, it counts as a workplace. And even if I'm the only person there and I want to smoke, I'm no longer allowed. Also prohibited in childcare facilities. And here's a kicker. The Minister of Health will be able to, at his or her discretion, prohibit in any new area. So if this is passed, even without any additional legislative functions, the minister can just say, hey, I'm just going to ban smoking everywhere. And that would be allowed in the current form of the bill. The bills also allow banning on advertising in many forms. So shops will not be allowed to advertise cigarette brands or that even selling cigarettes. There will be, and this is not just for tobacco. Sorry, I need to take a step back. This is not just for traditional cigarettes and tobacco. This is for vapes. This is for e-cigarettes. This is for any alternative to tobacco, even if it's safer, even if it's the FDA approved, even if it is proven to actually help people become less addicted to cigarettes, and it is provide and has nothing wrong with it. Those are included under tobacco in this broad definition. It's enforcing plain packaging, so there's no differentiation of brand, and it also wants to further restrict, wants to have no sales on internet, so no internet sales of tobacco products, no courier deliveries, and no electronic sales mechanisms. And crucially, it wants to create a monitoring committee that, alongside the minister, can just pass any new regulation relating to this ad nauseum without having to consult Parliament. I think I'll move on to you, David, because there's a lot more I could say about this, and I need to give you guys a chance.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things, and I brought this up in this panel discussion midweek at Podcast Party, and I'll share a link to that just now, is that this overregulation has consequences and second-order effects that people are not really considering. So you might get some anti-smokers out there who think, yeah, you know, we need to do something about the smoking problem. We don't want to see people smoking. But people are going to smoke. People like enjoying the feeling of inhaling tobacco into their lungs. I'm not one of them. I like to use my lungs for road running, and I think Sean does as well, although Sean's lungs are a lot more powerful than mine. So his ability to distribute oxygen throughout his body is probably more efficient than mine. But my point is, this is going to drive a massive uptick in illicit cigarette consumption. And I use illicit in air quotes because, and actually Ayanda put together some briefing notes for me for the discussion that I had on Tuesday. And I mean, some of the insights are actually quite remarkable. So, I mean, particularly during COVID, there was this 5-month ban on tobacco consumption. You remember, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, that's a bit of a blast from the past, a period we'd rather forget, the COVID lockdowns. And that 5-month ban, so from March to August, basically meant that the incidence of illicit tobacco consumption went from the base rate of about 30 to 35%. It jumped to about 60%. And the reason for that is because people were seeking alternatives wherever they could find it. And also there's been massive price undercutting that's been happening from these illicit tobacco producers. So nowadays, if you are a goody two-shoes who wants to buy a legal pack of cigarettes, you're going to pay anywhere between 25 Rand and 60 Rand. And if you are looking for cheap alternatives, you can find them for between 5 Rand and 20 Rand in the illicit market. And there's a big reason for this price disparity. So a lot of it is taxation and overregulation, the same old devils that we've been dealing with at the Free Market Foundation for the last 50 years. So the excise tax on a 20-pack of the traditional regulated cigarettes is about 22 Rand. And if you add VAT onto that, excise duty, you're going to be paying about 25 Rand per pack of cigarettes in tax alone. So of that range of between 25 Rand and 60 Rand for a traditional pack, you're going to be spending 25 Rand of that just on tax. So now a lot of these traditional established players are being absolutely hammered by this combination of the overregulation and taxation and the growth of the illicit market. And I just think this really makes my blood boil, because I'm not a smoker, but this is a real affront to consumer choice. And it's also symptomatic of like a really odious trend that we have this nanny state that's so overbearing and interfering in our daily lives, on the one hand. And on the other hand, can't do the basics. We've often referred to Bastiat, the 19th century French liberal, who spoke about the core function of the state being the protection of life, liberty, and property. And so the paradox of South Africa is that the state cannot do the basics, and yet it's trying to micromanage and nanny the whole of society, so supposedly for public benefit. I think Ayn Rand would have a field day here about all the virtue signaling and the hypocrisy that underpins such an attitude. So, yeah, that's my rant about cigarettes. And I think we also need to think, if there's a problem in society, you don't always have to regulate against it. My mother's probably watching this podcast, as she often does. And if my mother had caught me smoking when I was a teenager, she would have blixened me from here to Christmas. So, there's also a role for families, for social norms, for also personal responsibility. Like, if you want to regulate against every unhealthy activity, then you should be banning horse riding and skateboarding. And you speak to any trauma surgeon or orthopedic surgeon, and they'll tell you that most of the cases that they deal with are from people playing paddle on the weekends, or falling off of their bicycle and breaking their collarbone. These are hazardous activities. I used to go rock climbing, and every weekend there'd be somebody falling off of the bouldering wall and tearing their meniscus or something like that. But people like to do risky endeavors. Other people are more sedentary than Sean and I, and they prefer to sit on the couch, and they have kind of lifestyle-related diseases. So, we have to accept that society is not perfect. You can't perfectly engineer all outcomes, and there are second-order effects to these kind of actions.
I think that was a very good point you made, David, about personal responsibility, and especially the role of parents. Now, I also don't smoke. I detest smoking personally, but I believe that people should have a right to do it. And I hate the idea that people are enforcing their views, because I also know the government will very likely push their dislike on things I like doing. I like playing video games. Yet whenever there's any violence, the government is going to come in and blame video games for that. You can see that already people are trying to blame video games for the Charlie Kirk assassination. But the role of parents, I believe that more and more, and I think there's a fault of parents to a degree, want to substitute their responsibility for government legislation. Because a big call for the tobacco bills, especially the regulations on vaping, is the usual excuse of think of the children. And when of the portfolio committee discussions, the second or third most mentioned concern overall, the first being the problem is the illicit trade and this is not going to solve the illicit trade. The second being economic concerns, and that there's going to lose a lot of people, a lot of jobs, and we shouldn't be doing that when there's so much unemployment in this country. But the third was that people say, oh, we need to do this anyway because children are going to be smoking, they're going to be vaping, all that. And my simple question, answer to that is what you alluded to, David, is that parents should be enforcing the rules on their kids. That it's not the responsibility of legislation to parent people's children. It is the parents' job. It is it's teachers' jobs. And if they fail, it gets to then the law is not going to help either. Because are we really going to start a lot, as the one EFF portfolio committee member actually said, and stuck clockers right twice a day. They said that to enforce this law, we would have to have an apartheid level of totalitarianism. Sean, what are your thoughts on this delightful bill?
Yeah, okay. So I'm not an expert on these things like tobacco legislation and so on, but I do have a few thoughts. As David mentioned, my eccentric character will have me run every day, or swim or bike or whatever. Sometimes I don't have a lot to show for it, but I'll run around in a circle if I have to. So the next time I go to South Africa, I don't think this law is going to be selfishly my biggest concern, that some law enforcement officer is going to swing by my hotel in Sandton and tell me to stop smoking. But that's my personal observation anyway. But so a few things sort of come to mind, like the sort of efficient Northern European nanny state that knows best in a lot of parts of Northern Europe gets an enormous amount of its tax revenue from tobacco and alcohol. It's astounding, the numbers. I can't remember the numbers offhand. But obviously it's a bit of a different sort of environment. But I think in South Africa, the more legislation that comes out about these things, it just leads to people completely circumnavigating it altogether in the context of a weak state. So if you have very damaging and counterproductive and legislation on mining, for example, well, then all that will lead to is an increase in illegal mining, for example. And I don't see why that would be any different to something like tobacco. If you have all this legislation on this, that, and the other thing, this is going to lead to, I wouldn't say illicit, and people are just trying to survive, and businesses exist for this thing and making money or whatever. But it'll lead to them pursuing ways that are, possibly illegal or possibly outside the realm of their current functionality, in order to try and continue to do business doing what they're doing. So I think, was it R.W. Johnson made this point about the ANC not so long ago, that it's just legislating on everything. There's just this barrage of legislation about this, about that, and about the other thing. And it kind of reminded him of the Nats in the 80s, that there was legislation, that they were sort of losing power, and they sort of knew it, and the sort of default behavior was just legislate about this and legislate about that. And where does that all end? I don't know. In the context of the 80s, it ended where in a very short space of time, de Klerk burned a lot of the racial legislation. Slightly different. The parliamentary dynamics and the governance dynamics are slightly different now. My understanding is that sort of bonfire of legislation might be a bit harder now. But yeah, I don't know. These things are, I don't really know what their end game is with legislating against this kind of thing, really. Yeah.
I think something you alluded to, Sean, which is, I think it's very clear that with the ANC and any government which overregulates and overlegislates, it's very much a sign of an insecure, weakened state. because it's not actually helping. It's barely a band-aid over something which is more fundamental, more intrinsic. Ayanda, so you prepared David's briefing, so the expert steps up.
Well, no, I'm not an expert, not by the stretch of the imagination. But I used to be a smoker. I used to smoke cigarettes, so I know a thing or two about smoking cigarettes. And the one thing I can tell you for a fact is that smoking tobacco is a relatively inflexible habit. It's very difficult to stop smoking cigarettes. I know this firsthand, even though I don't smoke them anymore. So what happened during COVID, during the 5-month ban, with people buying illicit cigarettes, what that proves is that smoking is an inflexible habit. If you do ban the sale of tobacco, people will be driven to these so-called illicit markets where they do manage to access the cigarette and they do manage to smoke. So banning really doesn't do anything. The same can be said about banning alcohol as well. I mean, alcohol as well, there were also restrictions on that. And we also saw an increase in people brewing their own alcohol, in their own homes, in their own stores, etc. So that is the first point. Smoking is an inflexible habit, and banning it or imposing restrictions doesn't really make a difference if that is your aim. The second point that I want to move on to with this tobacco bill as well is that it also reminds me of a bill which the EFF has submitted to Parliament, if I'm not wrong, where they want advertising alcohol, if I'm not wrong, to be banned in the country. And this is where I want to go back to David's point that he made about the role of families in society and so forth. The point that I made to the EFF was banning the advertising of alcohol. If your goal is to reduce youth exposure or public exposure to alcohol, that again is not going to work, because the drivers of alcohol consumption in this country are deeper than that, So banning advertising at best is going to have a marginal outcome. What you want to do is to tackle the deeper drivers of alcohol consumption in this country. What are those drivers? I mean, unemployment, I would argue, is one of them. If you go into many townships across this country, you're going to find young people, some of whom do have degrees, they're graduates, and others, of course, only have matric certificates, others never finish school. But you're going to find young people in townships loitering around, sitting at township tuck shops, not doing anything with their lives. And more often than not, these are the young people who are drawn into drugs, who are drawn into alcohol and into all these things, because they're not up to anything. Youthful energy, when it isn't productive, can be very destructive. You need these young people to be in factories, producing things, making things, but they're idling around in townships. And that's how they get drawn into these lifestyles. There's also the question of exposure at home. I mean, I know this firsthand, where you see adults at home drinking alcohol in front of young children. This is unacceptable, but it happens in many families. So on one end, you have a bill saying you want to reduce youth exposure to alcohol, but these young people are seeing alcohol in the home before they even leave the home. They're seeing adults drinking at home in front of them. But then again, there's also the third factor when it comes to alcohol consumption as well. Broken families, trauma, parents who are neglecting their own children, parents who, gallivant, they procreate in the villages, and then they leave their homes, and then they go to Gauteng in search of work, or whatever it is. And in this regard, the welfare state we have in this country has also played a role, because it basically carries the burden of irresponsibility. It says that you can have children and not take care of them, because they're going to get free healthcare, free education, there's a grant from the state, and there are other benefits as well. So the incentives are perverse. You can literally have children. You can literally have children as a man and not take care of them, because the state will take care of them. But I think I'm digressing here. But my point is that the drivers of substances like alcohol and tobacco, they are deeper drivers of this. And attempting to take a shortcut through legislation or other measures is not going to be effective. What you want to do is to do the harder work. This is a point I also make to Christians when it comes to gay rights and stuff, that you can't just ban these things. If you actually want to have the kind of society that you want, you need to do the hard work of building that society that is founded on those Christian values, not use the state to persecute people on the basis of their sexual orientation, etc. If you want a society where young people aren't going to be gay, transgender, or bisexual or whatever, you actually need to do the hard work of building that society, of raising children, to not be gay, or raising children in a certain way that dissuades them from entering those lifestyles. But using regulation, taking the shortcut, driving up the cost of cigarettes, as David said, to a point where you can get an illicit pack for 5 rands to 20 rands, but a legal pack goes for 25 rands or anywhere between 25 rands and 60 rands. That creates problems, because there are incentives for people to actually go and buy those so-called illicit cigarettes, as opposed to buying one where 25 rands is going to the state in terms of taxation. So what we really need here in essence is a state that is less intrusive. We don't need a nanny state that is going to be paternalistic. We're dealing with adults here. These are people who make choices, they weigh the risks, and they're willing to accept the consequences of their own choices and actions. So you don't need to police them around. When I was smoking cigarettes, I knew precisely what the risks of smoking were. I didn't need anyone to tell me that, oh, you might get cancer or you might get sick. I knew exactly what I was doing. And I told myself that if I'm going to get cancer one day from smoking, it will be my own fault. Because when I began smoking, I knew that there are dangers associated with smoking. So what we need here really is a state that is less intrusive, that is not going to interfere in the lives of people, that is going to allow us as people in society to really resolve these issues. If it's tobacco consumption, we must fix that. If it's alcohol consumption, we need to fix that. We need to tackle a culture of drinking in communities across the country, of boozing and partying, of pens down, and all these things. That's how we even lost 21 young children years ago at the Enyobeni Tavern. It is precisely because of this culture of drinking that we have in our communities. And banning the advertising of alcohol, again, as I said, is not going to bring that to an end. There are deeper drivers of the consumption of substances. I think those are my main points around this.
That's an excellent way to actually conclude the episode. I think that we can all learn that South Africa has many problems, but all the solutions that the ANC and a lot of our government tries to push are trying to tackle the symptom, not the underlying disease. And that more and more we need to actually start at home, and that we need to ensure that we actually look at the problem, what's causing the problem, and stop trying to violate people's freedoms. And also stop trying to wreck our economy while we're doing it, because we've far past the Laffer curve on normal taxation, and also the amount of money that the government could actually make if they taxed cigarettes properly and stop trying to restrict the legal growth of the industry. They could probably fund a hang of a lot of public health care. Not to say that the public health care will be good, will be better than the money going into criminal syndicates, which will then outfit them to do more nefarious things. Sean, did you have a closing comment? Sorry.
Closing comment would be that South Africa has bigger fish to fry than regulating tobacco. The world's highest unemployment rate, officially, the world's highest crime rate. The two things are quite closely related, as a lot of people will know. You're damaging labor market legislation, edifice of laws, keeping people out of work. That needs burned, frankly. And people need to get into work. It needs to be easier for people to get into work. That would bring the crime rate down quite substantially. Very strong correlation between the two. As was proven, and I think it was in South Africa, the economy was doing quite well in the mid to late 2000s. Government has no business in regulating tobacco like this, and there's bigger fish to fry. South Africa has greater problems than people smoking on their porch.
Thank you. And now, everyone, thank you for joining us. Thank you, David. David, did you have a closing comment?
My closing comment is that when I said my mother blixemed me, I was speaking figuratively. So, Mom, I love you. Thank you for raising me right. But yeah, that's all from me. But yeah, I think we should just be very cautious about the nanny state, because even if you don't smoke, you should oppose this kind of thing, because one day they might come after one of your other habits. Like they might start regulating energy drinks because there's lots of sugar in there, Sean. So
might start regulating where I run around the suburbs of Santa.
yeah.
No, they tried that already during
there's
lockdown.
yeah, and it's an important principle. Like actually the government's not in charge of you, and they're there to uphold those basic fundamental rights, and they don't just get to dictate whatever it is that you do and consume. So yeah, I think it's an important principle to defend, even if you aren't a smoker.
And with that, we stand with our main principle. We stand for freedom. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Rational Standard podcast. Please make sure to check us out on Substack at rationalstandard.com, and make sure to subscribe so you can get our written articles. Make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. Please like and share and comment. It really does help with algorithms. And also make sure to check us out on Facebook and Twitter, X, the site formerly known as Twitter. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and cheers.
Take care.